The reason they arrested all these guys in the Congo, they said they were going to mount an armed coup. Listen, this is so insane. All the politics and all the people like Trump. There's stuff with Trump in here. Months and months and months later, he ends up getting indicted for tax fraud. It's just insane. Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I'm back, and I am going to be going over more of my story. This is part 9, and I'm going to be talking about Frank Amodeo, who is, if you've watched the other videos, you know Frank Amodeo is the bipolar megalomaniac lawyer that helped me get my sentence reduced, not once, but twice, but I've only gone over one. So let's go ahead real quick and let me explain Frank Amodeo's backstory, because I didn't really explain it when I initially introduced him. And let me get a little bit more into the story, because it is kind of a part of my story about being in prison. So after I got my sentence reduced, and I got back from getting my sentence reduced from, it was basically 26 years and 4 months down to like 19 years and change. So it was basically 26 years to 19 years. So I still have, with good time off my sentence, I still have 9 more years to do. Now you can do things like take the drug program, that sort of thing. And you can get a year off, and maybe you get a year halfway house. I thought I was going to get a year halfway house. I never did. I didn't. I got less than that, but I always thought I was going to get a year halfway house because I'd done so much time and I was nonviolent. But, anyway, we'll get into that later. So Frank Amodeo is the guy that I went to, and he helped me get my time reduced. Well, when I got back, a lot of guys were constantly reading the stories that I'd written. And I'd written my story. I'd written another story by about a guy named Ephraim Deveroli, which I'll also talk about. And I wrote a story about a guy named Doug Dodd and Lance Barabbas, and Lance Barabbas's brothers. He has 2 brothers. And I wrote, there was another guy named Richard in the story. It was basically a group of wrestlers that were doing doctor shopping for oxycodone, and they were shipping them up to colleges, throughout the country. Well, I wrote a story about those guys, and I ended up getting them in Rolling Stone magazine. So all of this was going on. I also wrote a story about a guy named Marcus Schrinker. I've written like 20, almost like over 20 stories. They were synopses. Some of those stories turned into books later, like I expanded them. There was so much information. It was such a good story and so compelling that instead of writing, let's say, a 20 or 30 page synopsis, I ended up writing a 200 or 300 page book. One of those stories that I wrote was on Frank Amodeo. Now, I haven't actually gone into all the stories, and I'm not going to go into all the stories, or this would be 100 hours of tape. Tape? There's no tape. Whatever. Footage. There's not even footage. So it would be a lot. It would be a lot of whatever this is. So I'm only going to go into the ones that are really kind of key to the crux of my story while I was in prison. And Frank Amodeo is definitely one of those guys. So I'd had multiple guys who had been reading my stories. Guys would come to me and say, "Hey, Matt, can I get one of your stories? You got any new stories? You got anything about drug dealers?" And I'd be like, yeah. And I'd give them something on a drug dealer. Somebody would come to me and they go, "Cox, bro, man, I heard you wrote a story about what's his name, that guy in B3. Can I see it?" And I go, "Yeah." I'd give it to them, and they'd read it, and they'd bring it back and give it to me, or they'd say, "Hey, can I keep it for another week? My cellie wants to read it," or whatever. And of course, I also have guys coming to me constantly saying, "Hey, man, you gotta talk to my cellie, or you gotta talk to this guy that just got here. He's got an amazing story. You definitely need to talk to him." And I would talk to the guy, and maybe I was interested in the story, maybe I wasn't, And I basically had a list of guys at this point. But one of the things that I wanted to do was write Frank Amodeo's story. Everybody told me I had to write it. I knew a little bit about the story and how he ended up in federal prison. I did not know the entire story until I obviously sat down with Frank and started writing it. So after I got back from going to, get my sentence reduced, and I came back, I said, Frank, we really ought to start talking about your story. And he was like, yeah, we do need to do that. We need to do that. And I said, look, let me just write a synopsis on it. Because nobody had ever written anything on Frank other than the newspapers. And I liked Frank. I respected Frank. And even despite the things I'm going to say about him, and his story in general, I have a deep found respect for Frank. I owe him a huge debt for helping me. So we sat down and I started writing his story. Now I sat down, I wrote an outline at first. Now the issue with Frank is that since he's been very young, he has heard or felt the presence of, or he says hears the voice of God. And that God has told him since he was a young boy that this is how he says it, preordained to be emperor of the world. Now, it's hard to say that without smiling. Because obviously there's a sickness there, right? So he's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but he's what you call a rapid cycling bipolar. So he's a rapid cycling bipolar with features of schizophrenia. So in his manic state, now he says he basically feels the presence of God all of the time, but in his manic states, it becomes clear what his destiny is. So he's hearing that God tell him what his destiny is during his manic states. And that is that he is ultimately going to conquer either economically or through force the planet, and he is going to bring a one world order to the planet, and all of the governments will dissolve, and he will be emperor of the world. Yeah. Now, when I sit down and I'm writing this, I remember just taking the outline. I'm outlining, and I'm like, okay, so when does this happen, and at what point, and what do they call it again? And I'm writing everything down, and he says, and I said, okay, well, Frank, you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And he was like, right. I said, so, I mean, obviously the voice of God or this delusion is connected with your schizophrenia and your bipolar disorder. And he said, well, see, that's the problem. That's the problem that the psychiatrists have, is that they equate they equate my belief that I will be emperor of the world with the features of schizophrenia. And I said, right. And I said, as opposed to what? And he goes, what it is. And I go, what is it? And he goes, the voice of God. And it's like, how do you argue with that? This is a guy that is literally doing people's paperwork and getting them cut loose from prison. You've got the United States government with an inexhaustible budget who are convicting people. They're coming to Frank Amodeo, who basically is working with drug dealers and sex offenders to help him do paperwork and fill out 2255s and fill out motions and everything else that he's doing, and filings and typing up his motions and he's dictating to them, and they're doing all of this legal work for him, with him. He has no budget, and he's working with criminals, the worst of the worst, and he is getting guys' sentences cut. Sometimes they're being cut loose and they walk right out of prison. Sometimes, and this is what typically happens. See, a lot of people think, oh, he gets your sentence overturned and you're released. Typically, that's not what happens, right? Typically, what happens is you get 20 years and Frank gets it cut down to 6 years or 11 years. He gets time shaved off because there's just nobody beats the government. what he can do, or what he's done, 90% of these guys that he helps have had their sentences reduced in some way. Sometimes he gets the conviction thrown out altogether. The guy walks out the door. That's not the norm, though. So what ends up happening is, so it's hard to not take him seriously. Well, even though what he's saying seems bizarre, it's, who am I to judge? I don't know. And so as I talked to Frank explained to me that since he was a young boy, he has had this delusion, which he does not believe is a delusion. He's had this delusion since he was a young boy. And he has several things that happened to him while he was young that he equates to God protecting him. One time he was walking on train tracks, and he heard the voice of God tell him to step off the tracks. And he stepped off the tracks just as a train came right up behind him and went right by him. I don't know if he was wearing headphones. I don't know exactly I forget what happened in the book. But he could have been killed. Another time, he was supposed to go with his favorite aunt. He was supposed to go shopping with her. And he, for some reason, stayed home. And he loved his aunt. He wanted to go. He just didn't go for some reason. And he didn't go. She ended up disappearing, and her body was found in a dumpster a few days later. She was murdered. Had he been with her, he probably would have been murdered also. Later came out, this is when he was a young boy, later came out that it was her fiance's boyfriend that ended up murdering her. So another time he wandered away when he was, 3, 4, 5 years old. He wandered away from daycare, and where they couldn't find him, and some stranger found him wandering around the neighborhood and picked him up and drove him back to the daycare. He wandered out into traffic. He's wandering around the streets. He could have been killed. He wasn't. He was saved. And he says that, hey, these are things that tell him that God was protecting him. So ended up in high school. He was a member of the Young Republicans. He often debated people on the radio. He was extremely bright, and he also constantly told everybody in school that he was going to be emperor of the world, and they laughed it off. They joked about it and ha ha ha, and they kind of shrugged it off, and his teachers thought it was funny, and it was kind of a running kind of joke. He was like, "Oh well, when I'm emperor, you'll see," and and he would laugh about it, but he also believed it. He knew how it sounded, so he's not delusional in such a way that he's an asshole. He's not, saying, fuck you, that's that's what's going to happen. You think I'm crazy. He's not. He knows it sounds crazy. And he's like, look, I know how it sounds, but I know the truth of what's happening. And so graduates high school, goes on to college in, I forget where. I wrote a whole book on it, by the way. So it's called It's Insanity. He went to college. And by the way, several people have picked up on the story. There's a guy named, what's that guy? Count Dankula? Guy named Count Dankula. You didn't know that? No, Dankula. Guy named Count Dankula. It's got almost 1 million views. He did an hour. The guy did an hour on Amodeo. He basically went to my website and almost read my synopsis, which is on my website of Amodeo. Not the whole book, or it would have probably been about 5 or 6 hours. Anyway, Frank goes to college. He ends up going to, oh God, Matt, come on, think about this for a second here. He ends up going to college, and he goes to law school in 1986. He goes to college, he graduates, then he goes to law school, and the CIA approaches him. And this is actually very common, I found out, after Frank had told me that the CIA had come to I think it was Emory. He'd come to Emory in Georgia. I believe it's in Georgia. Honestly, I can't remember. But the point is that he had taken a test, and the CIA had asked him to come in, and they wanted to hire him in special operations or something. They wanted to hire him, and that would be somebody that would be like a field agent, and which was odd, or somebody who would run field agents. Which is odd because if you saw Frank's probably 5'5", chunky. He probably wasn't chunky at this time, but he was in college. But he obviously was even look at no time do I ever see him being in good shape. So he's not an athlete. He doesn't scream CIA, but whatever. I actually interviewed a CIA agent about the book and about the story, and a lot of what he said in his interview is in the book. And he says that it was a common thing for the CIA to go and interview lawyers to try and get them to come and become CIA agents. Well, Frank was actually planning on, when he graduated, he was going to go to work for the CIA, but he didn't. He ended up, his father got sick and he couldn't leave. So what he did was he started a business, and he ended up getting his law degree and helping his parents out, and he went to work for a company that's a lot like H&R Block. It was actually started by the same guy that started H&R Block, and it was for bankruptcies. And so he went and he got a job as a bankruptcy attorney. And very quickly, he became very good at it. He's extremely analytical, very smart. Frank ended up leaving that a firm and starting his own firm with a couple of other guys. Frank starts this other firm, and he ends up being one of the premier bankruptcy attorneys in, I want to say, Atlanta. So he does very well for himself. Starts making a bunch of money. He ends up getting married. He marries a woman by the name of Claire. So he's doing great. As he ends up getting in trouble and going to a federal camp. And this is what's funny about this. This is good. He gets in trouble because he's overwhelmed with work. And his two partners really are just worthless. So these two guys are kind of worthless. Frank's the one doing all the work. Frank's bringing in all the money, and Frank has a massive panic attack, right? He goes into a deep depression. He ends up being hospitalized. But at the time, nobody thought that it was depression. They thought he was sick. They thought he might have pneumonia. They didn't know what he had, because this is back in the 80s and 90s. And back then, you weren't really, depression wasn't like a way to be ill. It was a mental condition, and you couldn't end up in the hospital as a result of depression, but he did. He still hadn't even been diagnosed with bipolar disorder at this time. So he's depressed. He gets out. By the time he gets out of the hospital and can go back to work, there have been multiple bankruptcy filings that have been missed. His two law partners had kind of pilfered the bank account, and some money that had been given to the firm had been used. So there was commingling of funds, and that's an issue. He ends up getting indicted by the local attorney, local district attorney was going to indict him, but they actually had a grand jury and they couldn't indict him. So she handed it over to the feds, and the feds indicted him. And they came back and they said they were going to give him, I think, 2 or 3 years probation, and he had to pay back the money, which he did. When they spoke with his wife at the time, Claire, they actually went to Claire and they were preparing his sentencing memorandum, which you give to the law. It's called your pre-sentencing report, and they give it to the judge. His wife said, "You can't give him probation. He has to go to jail. He's not going to learn his lesson." And if you knew it, that sounds harsh, but if you knew Frank, you would understand. He takes on too much. He was doing so much legal work. The guy barely ever slept, and honestly barely sleeps anyway. But he takes on too much responsibility, and he promises too much. So he gets overwhelmed. So she was saying he needs to be controlled. He needs to learn his lesson. He was overwhelmed himself. So she says he has to go to jail. He'll never learn his lesson. So they actually sent him to jail. I think he did a little bit less than a year, maybe a year. He goes to a camp. It's a boot camp. They had him at the time for the feds. You go to a boot camp, you jog, you run, they yell at you, you play soccer. You ate pretty good back then. And then they released him. By the time he was being released, this would have been in the 90s, and the Soviet Union had fallen. Berlin Wall came down. Russia broke apart. And Claire, his wife, who was also a lawyer, ended up going to, I forget, it was some of the stands like Tajikistan, whatever. She goes over there to some of the former Soviet bloc countries, and helps kind of reorganize their new governments. So she goes over there. He's left with like nothing. So Frank ends up, when he gets out, he ends up calling an old friend, and that old friend is, I can't believe I can't remember this guy's name. I talked to him. I interviewed him for hours and hours. He was a super interesting guy. I got to get his name. I'm so sorry. Yaniv Amar. So Yaniv contacts Frank. I think, or Frank, whatever. They got into contact. And Yaniv and Frank had actually gone into a small business partnership together. And so Yaniv meets Frank at like a Denny's and gives him, I think, like $30,000, and says that their little business venture, they had bought some stuff on consignment from a bank, from some place that was, not consignment. They bought some stuff from a company that had gone bankrupt, and Yaniv resold it, and he gave Frank like 30 grand. So Frank was like, great, I have some money, because he had nothing after spending a year in prison. And so Frank ends up taking the 30 grand, and he kind of restarts his life. And what he does is it gives him the opportunity to kind of start looking into doing some different things. One of the things he does is he ends up taking over a company that Yaniv was running, which was doing, it was like kind of like they were offering a universal credit card. So Frank takes over the company, and there were some issues with the company. He sorts those issues out. While he's sorting out those issues, he starts taking on clients from other companies that are in financial straits, right? Like companies that are on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, he can't be a bankruptcy attorney because Frank's been disbarred. All right. He was disbarred when he got his felony and went to prison. You can't be a felon and be a lawyer. You actually, in some states you can, but the first thing they do when you get a felony in pretty much any state is they disbar you. He was disbarred. Fourth cup of coffee today. Okay. So Frank goes out, and trust me, this is going somewhere. Frank goes out and he starts taking on clients of companies. Starts taking on companies as clients to help reorganize their companies. Or he places them in bankruptcy and reorganizes them through the bankruptcy laws. So a lot of times what Frank would do is, give you an example, you go to all your creditors, you're a company, and you go to all your creditors, and you say, look, we're going to do this one of two ways. You're going to either work with me on repaying this debt, or you're going to reduce the debt and let me repay you, or we will go into bankruptcy court and I'll bankrupt the company, and there's a chance you get almost nothing. Because that's pretty much what's going to happen if you go to bankruptcy court, unless you're some massive company. And even then, you get pennies on the dollar. So do you want to take 80 cents on the dollar, or you want to end up taking 15 cents on the dollar in 5 years from now? Or I can start paying you back the 80 cents on the dollar now. And that's what he would do. He would go into these companies. Well, this business venture starts to grow very quickly, as anything does with Frank, because he's a workaholic. He works probably 90 hours a week. And it grows very quickly. Well, let's not forget, Frank has not forgotten. He didn't get better when he went to prison. Okay? He didn't start getting medicated. He didn't stop hearing the voice of God. And he told me, I asked him about Claire. I said, did Claire know about this? And he said, oh, yeah. Claire and I used to talk about it all the time. Like, he said Claire would kind of joke about it. They'd go to dinner and they'd joke about this and they joke about this. Like, everybody kind of joked with him about it. But the guys that I interviewed for my book on him, they would go, they would tell you, they go, we'd kind of laugh about it. I go, so you guys just thought it was a joke? And they go, no, we knew it was real. Like, we knew that's what he really believed. Like, we would all joke about it, but there were times during these conversations when Frank would get very, very serious. Not that he would get angry or upset that you were joking about it, but you could tell that this is something that he very clearly had thought out. He had a plan. That plan was to build a company called Mirabilis. And that's what he did. Frank ended up starting a company called Mirabilis. Mirabilis it was based on the theory that Frank came up with when he wrote his thesis, which he never finished, in school. So he'd written a school. He was going to get his master's degree. He had to write a thesis. I don't think he ever got his master's degree, but he was going to write a thesis. He was going to get a master's degree. He ended up writing a thesis. That thesis was called Capital Genesis. Capital Genesis is based on a design where a company could buy up other companies and then use those companies' resources, right? For instance, you're a large manufacturer, and one of the things you have to do is you have to make copies of paperwork. You have to print brochures. So you use a printing company that's also owned by Mirabilis. So let's say that printing company. So now what happens is that all brochures or anything that's printed by any other companies, all of those contracts go to one of the companies that is within the Mirabilis umbrella. So if suddenly, let's say you own a security company and you needed cars for all of your security guards, you would buy them through a dealership that was owned by Mirabilis. So all of these companies it's like an alliance plan, right? So they're alliance, or they're all affiliates or associates of one another, but they're all owned by Mirabilis. Now, what Frank realized while he was in the middle of bankruptcy and he had started Mirabilis was that he wasn't in the middle of bankruptcy. While Frank was in the middle of doing his bankruptcy business, really his consulting business. So he was consulting with companies and helping reorganize them. He started making money doing this. He started getting stock, and he started getting millions of dollars being given to him for reorganizing companies and renegotiating the terms of their agreements from their creditors, getting them to hold off for 6 months, or getting the amount of money reduced, or whatever his plans were. He would get these things done. And one of the things he did was he would say he wanted to own a portion of the company. So he'd get stock and he'd place that stock in Mirabilis. Mirabilis would now own that stock. So they now own a portion of that company. So if you go into a company that's going bankrupt, they don't have the money to give you $5 million for your fee. So a lot of times he would take that money in the form of stock. Well, one of the things that Frank realized while he was doing all of this was, even when these large companies couldn't pay their debt, like they couldn't pay their suppliers and they couldn't pay certain things, the one thing that they always paid was they always paid their payroll taxes. I'm sorry. They always paid their payroll. So obviously, a company would collapse immediately if you didn't pay your employees. So instead of not paying your employees, they might not pay for steel that they needed to build cars or computers or microchips, or silicon, or maybe it would be roofing shingles. Maybe you have 3 suppliers of roofing shingles, and it's a contractor that puts on roofs. And so he just doesn't pay one of one of those suppliers, and he pays the other 2, and then he pays his employees because he's behind. So Frank noticed that they always paid their employees. So what Frank did was he went in, and as soon as he would go into a business, he would say, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to use a payroll company to do all of your payroll. So that's a way to reduce money for them, he would tell them, of course. So instead of you having your own HR person, right, your own human resources person, you have 800 employees. We're going to use this payroll company, and they're going to do all your payroll, and they're going to lease all of your employees back to you. That way, so all your employees basically end up working for this payroll company. And so what happens is that payroll company, as they get more and more employees that they lease out, they are then in a position to negotiate things like workman's comp, 401k programs. They're in a position to negotiate health insurance, things of that nature. They're in a position to negotiate with those big companies. Like, hey, we have 10,000 employees. Technically, it's a leasing company. They lease out all the employees, but it doesn't matter. So here's the thing: as these I don't want to say temp companies, these employee leasing companies or employee payroll companies are growing. And you have to understand that. Let me clarify this just to kind of jump through it. These companies, he ends up with 40,000 employees. All right. So very quickly, Mirabilis and the companies that it owns end up with 40,000 employees, bringing in like $500 million. Is it $1 billion a year or $500 million, $500 billion? I forget how much money they were bringing in every single year. It was outrageous. Oh, it was nearly $1 billion in annual revenue. 40,000 employees and nearly $1 billion in annual revenue are what his company was bringing in. So by this point, Frank is a multi-millionaire and growing. He still has an issue, right? And that issue is this. He believes he's preordained to be emperor of the world. And now he has a whole bunch of money. So here's what Frank does. You would think like, hey, being filthy rich, like that's cool. Like I'm good with that. But that's not God's plan. God's plan is world domination through Frank Amodeo. Here's what Frank does. Frank starts negotiating with he starts negotiating with like a company that builds airplanes in Russia to become partners. But what they used to build was ICBMs. They now build airplanes. He also starts negotiating to buy a fleet. I say fleet. It's a squadron, small squadron, about 24 F-15s and F-16s, used F-15s and F-16s. He also negotiates with the Cypriots to keep the planes on Cyprus, because you can buy an F-15 or an F-14 or an F-16, but when you buy them, they strip all of the guts out. Like they strip they call it's declawing them. They take all the parts out of the plane that make it lethal. So it doesn't have guns, it doesn't have missiles. But if you take the planes and you bring them to Cyprus, you can have all that stuff put back in. So he's building a small air force. Really, honestly, if you had 24 of the F-15s, you got a bigger air force than most countries. So he's negotiating with those, and believe it or not, apparently you can get them for a couple million a piece. He's got, I think it ends up being something like he was negotiating like $60 million to try and buy these planes. The other thing he does is he buys several companies, and there's like 3 of them, but I'm just going to call them one. And it's called tactical private security. So there were like 3 of them, but I'm just going to, instead of saying this company, they were all basically under the umbrella of tactical. So it's a private military. So these are guys that protect executives. They do things like, for instance, let's say the DEA, and this is something that was hilarious. So Frank tells me that the DEA, let's say they have a drug dealer. Let's say there's a drug dealer from Colombia. They know he lives in Argentina. Well, they have no jurisdiction to get him in Argentina, but they know he's there. The Argentinians won't come get him. So what Frank does is tactical. The DEA says, look, they put a contract out to private security firms like Tactical, and they say, look, if this guy shows up in the United States, we'll cut you a check for $250,000, no questions asked. So Frank's guys go out there, they find the Colombian living in Argentina, and they watch him for a week, find out his routine, and then one day a van pulls up, a guy jumps out, walks up behind him, hits him with a taser, throws a black bag over his head, zip ties him, throws him inside the van. They drive straight to an Air Force. They jump on one of one of Frank's private planes, and they fly him back to the United States. They get to the United States, they call the DEA while they're still on the tarmac, and they say, hey, by the way, we have whoever, we have Juan Carlos Sanchez, and we've got him right here, and he's wanted, and bring us our check. And so what do? They show up with a check. I don't know if they show up with a check. They might mail it later. I'm just saying it's good for dramatic effect. Whatever. They show up with a check. They throw old Juan in the back of the Suburban, and they hand the guys at Tactical a check for $250,000. Not a bad business, assuming you don't get caught in Argentina and executed for kidnapping people. But Frank's guys are doing this all over the place. Now, by the way, I'd also like to mention that Tactical is run by a guy named Kevin Billings and a guy named Joe Robinson. There's also another guy. He's really irrelevant. So anyway, these two guys, basically Billings runs the whole operation. Joe also works for Tactical. But there's several dozen guys that work for this company. And according to Frank, they also had, I say according to Frank, but I also saw the article on it where they were delivering, there was something called the Seeds of Hope program, where they were delivering seeds to Afghanistan. So Frank had contracts with the Afghan security forces to provide security in Afghanistan. So his guys would protect convoys of seeds and food and things of that nature. So he had one of those many private security groups in Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, those are guys that work for Tactical. Some of them. I mean, there's lots of little groups that do it. So Frank's guys do lots of different things. All right. Billings does lots of things. Well, at some point, Frank is approached by a guy. He actually happens to be a doctor. Doctor, is it Kashad or? I'm so sorry. Oh, okay. So, in December of 2005, Frank is approached by Dr. Oscar Kashala. All right. So Dr. Oscar Kashala was born in the Congo. All right. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC. So he was born there, but he was raised in the United States and he was educated in the United States. Well, in the Congo, you have to have been born there. You have to be a citizen and have been born there to run for president. Well, the current president had been president for, I don't know how long, 8-10 years. His father had been president for 8 or 10 years prior to that. And it was actually rumored that the current president had murdered his father and took his position. Now, keep in mind that you're supposed to have democratic elections, the whole thing. Well, Oscar Kashala comes to Frank and says, listen, I need you to, first he says he wants them to provide security. Frank's like, and he says, why would my guys provide security? And then he explains, look, I need them to provide security in the Congo because I want to run for president. So Frank ends up coming up with an agreement with Kashala where he says, I will provide security for you, but I also want to run your campaign. And I will funnel money in to back your campaign. However, if I get you elected, I want you to run your entire country based on the capital genesis, the theories of capital genesis, and I want a portion of the mineral rights of the Congo. Now, the Congo has the largest supply of minerals anywhere on the planet. Now, it's hard to get to those minerals because they've been constantly in civil wars for about 40 or 50 years. But Frank's not stupid. He figures he can go in there with his private security and he can quail any types of upheaval especially if he has the presidency, because essentially he's now a part of the presidency, he's a part of the government, and he can basically get to the minerals. I'm not saying Frank's going to take everybody out and execute them that puts up a fight, but I'm not saying it either. So he's got his private security. Oh, the other thing is, this is the great thing, that Frank wanted to go into the Congo and actually hire the Congolese and train and build his own private military. Now, all this seems far-fetched because Frank's a multi-millionaire at this point, but this is a lot of money. Let me give you an idea of the scope of what an operation like this costs and where Frank came up with the money. Frank came up with the money by holding back on the payroll taxes that he was supposed to be sending to the IRS. And this is where the scam comes in. So far, everything Frank has done is legal. But Frank wants, he's got to take over, right? Like God's not putting money in his bank account. You can't pass the collection jar around and save up enough money to buy F-15s and F-16s. Those puppies are expensive. So he needs his planes. He's got some security. He's got a lot of stuff, but it's not enough. But what Frank does notice, obviously, and I'm sure this is all part of the plan, is that the 40,000 employees that he's paying every single week and the money that's flowing into the coffers of Mirabilis, that part of that money that comes in from all these various companies, which, by the way, one of the things Frank specializes in is military-based companies. So he has a company that he bought, which built they built satellites, portable satellites for the Army. All right? He's bought companies that make distillery water distillery systems. He bought a lot of these companies that he's bought have military. They're specific to the military, right? They have military. What's the word I'm looking for? Military. Military. Damn. Somebody leave me a comment. So they have. There's ways that you can use these companies to help support the military or get contracts with the military. And he has contracts with the military. He has an asbestos company that removes asbestos from military types of naval vessels. He has all of these various companies that some of them have a lot of them have to do with military operations. So one of the things he does is he gets all the money coming in from the 40,000 employees and he stops. Let me explain how it works. So if you make $1,000 a week, Frank's company withholds $150, $200 because some money has to be sent to the Social Security Administration. Some money has to be sent to the federal government to pay your federal income taxes, right? Money goes to Medicare. Money goes in different places. Well, the payroll company takes that money and then they pile it up and then they shoot it to the correct places, right? To the federal government, to the IRS, to whoever. So what Frank did was he started holding back on sending that money to the government. And we did this in the process of renegotiating these companies' debts. When he would take on a new company, he would renegotiate and he would withhold the payroll taxes. And then he would go to the IRS and he would tell the IRS, we can't pay you. And then he would negotiate with them for less money. So if his company owed, this company he just took on owed $4 million, he would negotiate with the IRS to pay them $1.5 million over the next 3 years until they got caught up. And they would accept that deal. But keep in mind, he had the $4 million. He would keep $2.5 million. And he would take that money, he would refunnel that money to fund things like Oscar Kachala's presidential run to be president of the Congo. So as a result of this, Frank's guys go in. They hire a bunch of. They hire some. Look, I'll be honest. They hire some mercenaries. They hire some guys from Nigeria. They hire some guys from South Africa. South Africa and Nigeria, by the way, are notorious for hiring mercenaries with private soldiers. So Frank's guys go in. They hire a bunch of these private, not mercenaries. They call them private security. So they hire a bunch of private security to protect Kashala. Some of the guys that are there are Kevin Billings and Joe Robinson. Joe Robinson was actually on the SWAT team. Joe Robinson also helped run Mayor Buddy Dyer, who was the mayor of Orlando. And you have to understand too, by this point, Frank has relocated to Orlando, and he occupies the first 3 floors of the Sun Trust building. So he's running his entire operation. He's running Mirabilis out of the Sun Trust building in downtown Orlando. They funnel so much money into Nigeria for this guy, Oscar Kashala. Oscar Kashala, when he first went in, he was 32nd. Out of all the people running for president, he was 32nd. Within 6 months, he goes from like 32nd all the way down to he's tied for second place. The problem is that the guy tied for second place, the second guy tied for it. So the current president has the best position. He's in the best position. Looks like he's probably may win. Oscar Kashala and this other guy are tied for second and third. They're kind of bouncing. The other person is a general. Now in Nigeria, you can be a general and you can run for president. The other thing is that the military is very secularized there. So you can be a general there. And it's not like here in the United States where if the president calls a general and says, hey, I need you to do this and this, yes, sir, they do it. It's more negotiations there. They give them money to protect, but it's not like they're just at your beck and call. So you have to be on pretty good terms. You have to think African countries are often overthrown by military coups within the ranks of their own military. Well, so you got to think, now you've got a general that's actually running for president. The problem is Oscar Kashala is one of the only candidates running for president who's never murdered anybody. So he's looking pretty good to the Nigerians. They're like, this guy's U.S. educated. He speaks well. He's smart. He's not a murderer. He hasn't committed genocide. Like it might be a good deal to get this guy in. African politics is a violent industry, right? So it's not like the United States. So Kashala is doing so well that at one point, the general who's also running sends his troops in to a compound, not where Kashala is, because Kashala is actually in a hotel in downtown. I forget the name of the city he was in, but basically in the capital. He's in a building downtown with about 24 of Frank's guys, but there's 31 or 32 other guys that are in this compound, an off-site compound, where there's a bunch of private security that Frank's hired, including Kevin Billings and Joe Robinson. Well, the military comes in the middle of the night and they arrest all of these guys and they held them captive. And Frank finds out about this. I mean, this is a big deal. It's in the newspaper. It's on the radio. It's on all of the, CNN picks it up. It's on the in Orlando. They were talking about it. And so Frank's in there, and Frank and the State Department and the Secret Service negotiate for 9 days to get these guys back. Now, there's actually a video on my channel. It's called 9 Days in the Congo. We can, if Connor remembers. We'll put the link in the description, and it's called 9 Days in the Congo, and it's about it's a documentary, and you'll get to see Frank Amodeo. So Frank Amodeo is in the documentary. So is Kevin Billings, Joe Robinson, like several guys. They show the whole thing, and these guys are held. And keep in mind, these guys, this is in good conditions, horrible conditions. They're dragging these guys out of the barracks or the cells every few days and doing like mock execution where they call the news and they put guns to these guys' heads and they threaten to kill them. And anyway, by the time they finally negotiate, and it's long and drawn out, but after 9 days, they finally negotiate with the general, with the military, and they get them to release these guys. Kashala ends up taking third or fourth place in the election. He does not win. Frank gets all of his guys back. And you have to think, Frank's hired former Secret Service agents, former FBI agents, former special forces. He's got a serious security force. Now, this brings Frank to like national attention. Okay, because now there's all these newspaper articles and everything about him and about this guy and about his group. Like, who the hell is this guy? Like, suddenly they find out about Mirabilis and they're all over him. So Frank ends up, he's look, by this point, I think he's got 80 million. No, I'm sorry, not 80 million. 80 million. That's nothing. $180 million. I think he's got about $180 million at this point. He ends up negotiating with the new president. Well, it's not the guy that won, the current president of the Congo. Negotiates with him to try and come in there and purchase the mineral rights. The other thing that he does is, I forgot to tell you. By the way, the whole thing, the reason they arrested all these guys in the Congo, they said they were going to mount an armed coup. Like they were armed, that basically they were trying to say that Frank was backing an armed coup. Now, Frank says he wasn't, but the newspaper articles that I read all said that Frank says his guys didn't have any guns. The newspaper articles say that they did have guns, and it was an armed coup that they were trying to pull off. Frank says we were just there providing security, and they were managing the campaign. So the point is that Frank turns around and he backs NATO. He backs a NATO summit in Latvia. It was in Riga in Latvia, and at this point, Frank was approached by a conglomerate of people, a conglomerate that work for like the oligarchies, or a specific group of oligarchies who are trying to build natural gas pipelines throughout Europe. And part of where they want to go through is they want to go through Tajikistan. So they approach Frank after seeing the Congo affair. And once again, I go all into it in the book. Like, I can't get into it right now, but it's good stuff. The point is that they approach him and they ask him, they basically tell him that they want him to take over Tajikistan. Now, you have to understand that Frank already has security forces along the border or close to the border of Tajikistan in Afghanistan. And what these oligarchies are saying is that, look, they've already got an arrangement with the military where the military will allow Frank's guys to drive right into the capital, go into the presidential palace, and take it over. So these guys just have to drive in there and enter. It's basically like driving in. It's like the Secret Service saying, look, we're not going to say anything if you guys come into the White House and arrest the president. Like, we're not going to do nothing. We're going to back up. We'll let you guys just come on in. So he's got 50 or 100, 150 guys that are ready to go in. So Frank's about to do all this. And Frank ends up while this is being put together, this whole thing is being put together. And once again, you have to understand this is all about, it's about natural gas pipelines. It's about mineral rights. It's all the same stuff. And Frank is also still negotiating with the Congolese president. So while this entire thing is happening, he ends up going to Riga, to Latvia, to Riga for the NATO summit. And Frank actually is one of the backers of the NATO summit. Like they're the ones who they put up like whatever, $5-10 million to organize this whole thing. And it's like $300 million to put one of these things together. It's like a week-long thing, and fly out all of these different political parties and political guys, and they put it all together, and Frank's there, and Frank's speaking, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on. So he's there. While he's there, he's actually approached by the CIA and told that they know what's happening, and they tell him basically to back off. So while that whole thing's happening, Frank ends up at a party of NATO, NATO members. He's at like a cocktail party. While he's at the cocktail party, he's talking to several people, and they're mentioning that they saw, this thing's been everywhere, that the Congo thing is everywhere. So some of the people say, what did you want with the Congo? Like, what happened in the Congo? And he explains, well, I mean, I had an agreement. We were hoping to get our guy in as president, but obviously that didn't work, but I'm currently working with the current president. And as he starts talking, they said, yeah, but what happens once you go in the Congo? Like the region it's unstable. Frank says, well, we're going to go in and we're going to get all the minerals, and we're going to get all the mining rights, and we're going to mine all of the natural resources in the Congo. And I'm going to build the largest private military on the planet. He said, and then he said, we won't need NATO anymore. And he kind of has this manic moment, this manic episode where he says, I'm going to build this massive military and I'll be able to police the entire planet, and we won't need NATO anymore. That kind of takes people back. He doesn't really realize what he said. And what happens is he goes and he gets on the plane. He's flying back to the United States. And in between flying on his private jet back to the United States from Latvia, phone calls are made. People burn their midnight oil. And within a day or two of him getting back, he's been indicted for tax fraud. So actually, he wasn't actually indicted right then. Target letters were sent out. So a few days later, he's given him several target letters. People start getting target letters, subpoenas. They start investigating. They actually investigated him for months. I'm sorry, I was wrong about that. He got the target letters first. Months and months and months later, he ends up getting indicted for tax fraud. Charged with tax fraud or indicted with tax fraud? I'm not sure exactly what, but he gets indicted. So he ends up getting arrested for tax fraud, for withholding the tax funds, even though he had negotiated with the IRS. He'd negotiated with the IRS to pay them less money on a payment plan, and he'd been making the payments. Technically, that's not illegal. What the illegal part is when you have the funds and you're rerouting the funds. Now, according to Frank, that's not illegal either. Regardless, he ends up pleading guilty. Now, here's what happens. He goes off of his... Oh, I didn't even mention that I have pictures of him with George Bush. I didn't even tell you this. Like, during this whole thing, he ends up going to Washington. He goes to Washington, meets with George Bush, right? Junior, not senior. So George W. Bush, he meets with him. Listen, this is so insane. All the politics and all the people like Trump. There's stuff with Trump in here where he had, I found a newspaper article and talked to Frank about how he outbid Trump to take over Trump Towers in Tampa. They were building Trump Towers, and Frank came in and outbid Trump. It's just insane. He actually met with President Bush. I have pictures of him in the White House, and these aren't like photo op pictures where he's standing next to him at a $10,000 a plate dinner. These are where he's in like the Roosevelt room with members of NATO and security, and he was actually being debriefed for something to do with security and tactical and the security it was providing in Afghanistan. So I'm saying there's all kinds of political connections here. So Frank ends up he gets indicted. They investigate him. They don't really have anything on him. But after like 6 months or so, he ends up, for some reason, I think they indicted him. Finally, they might have indicted him or charged him. I forget, but he ends up agreeing to plead guilty. And the way that happens is he basically, at this point, he's kind of self-medicated using, this is going to sound insane, but he's hyper he's affected really badly. I don't know why I can't think. He's hypersensitive to caffeine. So what he does to keep himself up all the time is just drink Pepsis and Coca-Cola. I think it's Pepsis. Drinks them all the time to keep him up. And when he doesn't have Pepsi or caffeine in him, he drops. So what happens is he ends up so he goes in, he's going to plead guilty, but he thinks he can plead guilty saying that I didn't realize that this was a crime, or that I didn't think this was a crime. And he thinks he's going to end up with some kind of probation or something. And so he decides he's going to plead guilty. And what happens in the process of this whole thing, he's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so they end up asking him to go to McLean, which is it's a Harvard owned hospital. So they end up sending him there for an evaluation to see if is he sane or not. He goes there for, I think it's like a week or two. And while he's there, they put him on a ton of medication. They put him on so much medication that when he goes back to court, he's literally drooling out of the side of his face while he's there. He is convinced by his lawyer to take a plea. Now, here is what happens. His lawyer is telling him, look, Frank, you're going to take a plea. You get in front of the judge. They're going to recommend that they give you a few years. And all you have to do is get in front of the judge and explain to him about the bipolar disorder. And if you explain that to him, I'm sure he's going to end up giving you probation. So the guy convinces him of that. Now, here's the reason that Frank believes he convinced him to take a plea and didn't want to go to trial, was because the U.S. attorney had gone to Frank's lawyer and said, look, he gave you $1 million retainer. We're going to claw that retainer back. We're going to take that retainer from you because that's money that was supposed to go to the IRS. So we're going to take that money from you, and you're going to end up defending this guy for nothing. You're going to lose $1 million. Or if you convince him to take a plea, you can keep the retainer. So he ends up convincing Frank to take a plea, but if he takes the plea and he pleads guilty, he can go in front of the judge, explain the situation, and he believes he can get him some kind of probation or maybe a year or two. So Frank goes in and he takes a plea. He pleads guilty. He then explains the whole situation to the judge. He is drooling. The amount of medication that he was on, like if you were to read it's outrageous how much medication he's on. Well, he gets on the stand. He tells the judge the whole thing. He sits down. It's time for sentencing. The judge gives Frank 22 years. 22 years. Frank gets to the low, right? And you have to understand during this process, Frank he's had his rights stripped. The government strips him of his rights, and he becomes a ward of the state. And he's given like they give you someone that looks after you, right? So he actually has someone that watches over him. He can't sign checks. He can't sign a contract. He can't do anything. And the government knows this, and they had him sign a plea agreement without passing it by the person that's been assigned to him. It's like an ex-lawyer. It's like a guardian. Without passing it by his guardian, they have Frank sign paperwork saying he pleads guilty, get sentenced, and go to Coleman. The guy, Frank, is at Coleman when he finally calls his guardian. And the guardian, when he talks to him, he's like, hey, Frank, and the guardian thinks he's in the county jail. Hey, Frank, let me know when you're going to go to trial. And he goes, go to trial? What are you talking about? I've already been sentenced. I got 22 years. I'm in federal prison. And the guardian's like, how could you have been sentenced? How can you even plead guilty? You're not even allowed to sign a contract. You can't write a check. You're not allowed to make any decisions. Government knew it, did it anyway. Put him on a bunch of medication. He could barely even understand what was happening. He's babbling. Anyway, they give him 22 years. He goes to federal prison. They keep him medicated for over a year. Let me tell you why that's important. When you're sentenced in the federal system, you have 1 year to file what's called a 2255. So, if you do not file the 2255 within 1 year, so basically you have a 2255 is basically you're saying, hey, my lawyer was ineffective, or there was a mistake with my sentencing. We need to correct this. It's basically like an appeal. You have 1 year you're allowed to file it. If you do not file it within 1 year of your sentencing, then your sentence becomes final. And you cannot file a 2255, which means basically you have almost no way to correct your sentence. Now, Frank is a master at getting around these things. And that's, by the way, that's called being time barred. So what ends up happening is they keep him heavily medicated for over a year. Now, after a year, he finally convinces them to take him off the medication. And as they take him off the medication, and he starts to file his paperwork, he is now past the deadline to file a 2255. So Frank's 22-year sentence becomes final. And he's stuck with 22 years. So, Frank being Frank, he immediately starts educating himself with the law and filing paperwork and studying, and basically puts himself through like a master's course in law. And he ends up learning everything he can. He gets all these guys. He starts training all these inmates on the law. He starts teaching what they call a legal research class, which is it's called an ACE course. It's an adult continuing education course, and it's on how to research case law using the legal computers, how to write motions. He starts teaching these guys how to file motions, how to do everything. And he starts working to actively help other inmates while he's also filing his own paperwork in his own case, which is just constantly denied because he's time barred. And there are ways around it, but it's difficult. So that is Frank Amodeo. And if you're interested in reading the book, you should. I mean, there are situations that are the ins and outs of the CIA coming in and out of his life. I remember one time I heard, this is funny. One time I had heard that Frank used to wear a Darth Vader helmet around the office. One time he actually came into a meeting, a board of directors meeting, with the Darth Vader helmet on and conducted the entire meeting in the Darth Vader helmet. I mean, the guy is nuts. It's hilarious. I mean, that to me, and I didn't believe that. I thought that's just bullshit. I don't think that's true. Listen, I got the transcripts from his sentencing, And one of the board of the directors, a woman who was a lawyer, Edie, her name was Edie something. She talks about how she was at a meeting when Frank came in wearing the Darth Vader helmet. This is when they're talking to her about him being mentally incompetent, and she's like, well, he did conduct a meeting in a Darth Vader helmet one time. That was a little weird. So the whole book is just, it's amazing. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing story. And yeah, so with that said, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to do the next part that I do in the story will be about how Frank helped me to get my sentence reduced a second time. And he's in that story too, by the way. So for a second time, Frank is going to be in the story continuing because he helps get me my sentence reduced. And I appreciate you guys watching. I would like it if you would join my Patreon. I mean, you could do it for like $10 a month. You can do it for $50 a month. You can do it for $125 a month. I prefer the $125, but either way, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and hit the like button. Leave me a comment in the comment section. I love comments. And I really do appreciate you guys watching this. And sorry if this was really long. Hopefully the next one won't be this long, but I am a talker. All right. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, and see ya.
Buried by the U.S. government and ignored by the national media, this is the story they don't want you to know. When Frank Amodeo met with President George W. Bush at the White House to discuss NATO operations in Afghanistan, no one knew that he'd already embezzled nearly $200 million from the federal government. Money he intended to use to bankroll his plan to take over the world. From Amadeo's global headquarters in the shadow of Florida's Disney World, with a nearly inexhaustible supply of the Internal Revenue Service's funds, Amodeo acquired multiple businesses, amassing a mega-conglomerate. Driven by his delusions of world conquest, he negotiated the purchase of a squadron of American fighter jets and the controlling interest in a former Soviet ICBM factory. He began working to build the largest private militia on the planet, over 1 million Africans strong. Simultaneously, Amodeo hired an international black ops force to orchestrate a coup in the Congo, while plotting to take over several small Eastern European countries. The most disturbing part of it all is, had the US government not thwarted his plans, he might have just pulled it off. It's insanity, the bizarre, true story of a bipolar megalomaniac's insane plan for total world domination. Available now on Amazon and Audible.